Hey IT friends, how you doing? Happy Tuesday. So I have a unique opportunity today. We don't get a lot of these posts in our MSP where we have end clients or co-managed clients of MSPs coming in and asking questions to the MSP community. And every now and then when we get them, I'm always like, oh, I gotta make a video on that. I never do. So I'm gonna strike while the iron's hot. This is a really great example because I think it really shoots down to the core disconnect that many MSPs will have with especially our co-managed or our clients that actually have an IT person on site that is actually capable of doing IT. You know, I don't mean nephew tech. Like I mean like they really do have an IT person, but they're not a business person and they're not an MSP person. And that can usually create this weird disconnect. And so this post we're going to talk about highlights that. And hopefully I'll make a video here that some of you can use to help explain this concept to your co-managed clients. So the post in particular, there was a company supported by an MSP that had a Citrix-based VDI, virtual desktop, and they wanted to make a change the client wanted to make a change to the VDI image, which would then get, propagated. And the MSP was saying, sure, no problem, but we're going to charge you 3 hours to make that change. And so the initial point of this post was this poster was asking, is this okay? Should it be part of normal updates? In this particular case, it was to update to the new version of Teams. This seems really simple. Why are they doing this? And they made it very clear they have not yet read their contract to know if this is a contractual obligation or not. And so I want to kind of talk about the idea behind this and some insight as to why an MSP of a co-managed client might want to charge some hours for something like this. I'm not an expert on the technicalities, so I'm going to kind of take the side of the co-managed client here and say this sounds relatively simple from a technical standpoint. Like, don't you already run updates? Don't those updates already basically go into what accounts to be the golden image here? Aren't you already doing this? Why are you looking to charge me more? And I want to offer a little insight into why an MSP would do that. I'm not going to split hairs here on whether it's in their contract or not. We don't know from this post. And it very well that could just simply be the answer. In some cases, the contract says this is a move add change and therefore is billable. And if that's the case, and you are the co-managed client of your MSP, read the entire contract and make sure you understand it all. And if you're not the person who signed the contract and you were handed it later, maybe you're the on-site IT manager, or at least de facto you perform that role, I would still read it. And if you don't understand it, meet with the MSP. Most MSPs, even though they are a for-profit business, they're not being predatory here. And they would be happy to sit down with you and actually explain what the different elements of the contract mean. And a good MSP will probably have a scope of work that either is part of the contract or is sort of parallel to the contract that should outline pretty clearly what they will and won't do as part of their services. That might solve everything right there. So we're just going to pretend that if that conversation is had eventually, that'll take care of itself. And we're also not really going to unwind from a technical standpoint whether this particular task should or should not warrant any additional steps. I don't know enough about updating to new teams on a VDI, so I'm just going to take everybody at face value here. The MSPs that say it's a lot of work, okay, and the end client sysadmin who says it's not, okay. We're going to table that to the side. We're just going to talk about philosophically, why would your MSP at all want to charge for anything like this that could be argued to be outside the scope of basic support? So the real reason and sort of the point I wanted to make this video on, I think a lot of co-managed clients and a lot of internal IT folks don't really understand until they've been at an MSP for a significant amount of time at a level where they're able to pay some attention to the business, is MSPs have to worry about supportability later. And if you don't want to watch the whole video, that's why you would charge a few hours to do any sort of move add change, because ultimately you have to support it later. So if you are a sysadmin somewhere in a co-managed situation, or sort of de facto performing the role of co-managed at your client, there's an interesting relationship that you have with IT. So unlike an MSP, and we can compare this to other industries. So let's say you're working in a facility that's big enough where you are the facilities manager. And that means that you're going to have somewhere in the building probably some sort of workshop that's going to have some tools in it so that you can do some basic repair and maintenance on the facility. Yeah, that's pretty reasonable. We'd all agree for that. What you're not going to have in that workshop are probably expensive specialty tools. So you might have a miter saw, or you might have a table saw. You might have a couple of basic woodworking tools. You're definitely not going to have an 8-inch jointer over on the side. You're not going to have a drum sander. You're not going to have a 16-inch radial arm saw. You probably aren't going to have a track saw. Like, you're not going to have specialty woodworking tools. And MSPs, to bring us back to IT, MSPs generally have those specialty IT tools because that's their line of business. They have to buy those tools because that's what they're selling. And an internal IT department, generally speaking, is not going to have the same access to those specialty tools. So why do I bring this up? Well, first of all, that sucks. Sorry, sysadmins of the world. I wish you had more specialty tools. But more importantly, that means that a lot of sysadmins then have to go in and solve problems with time and brain power versus tools and efficiency. I'm not saying you don't have SOPs and that you're wasting time. What I am saying is that an internal sysadmin, I could go sit in a network closet for an entire week to figure out which port isn't working and troubleshoot that. And whether or not my boss at the company I work for is happy I did that is another story, but I have that ability. I can park myself somewhere and give my full attention to trying to solve a problem with time and basically the brute force of my mind. MSPs don't have that luxury at all. An MSP has maybe an hour to try and solve that same problem. And there's good and there's bad from that. That's why we see with a lot of MSPs, we see them accused of putting Band-Aid solutions in, because oftentimes they don't really have time to put in the proper solution. But on the flip side, it also means MSPs are generally pretty good at figuring out what could go wrong from doing this thing. And so that's sort of the initial relationship you have going on if you're co-managed versus an MSP. So what does that mean? So you may have listened to all of that and be thinking, all right, that's fine. I accept all of that. But given that I accept that the MSP needs to be careful about making a change, wants to put a little more time than I would into making sure it doesn't destroy everything and they're ready to support it, kind of all sounds like the MSP's problem, right? Why are they charging me? Shouldn't you said earlier, Dean, that they were cost of goods sold. Shouldn't this be additional cost of their goods sold? Well, yes, but no. And this once again goes back to if you are in an internal IT role and you've spent a decent amount of time working at an MSP previously at a high enough level in the organization, we have a little bit of time to ponder the business mechanics, you'll realize why the answer really is a no. But I think from like a superficial, like looking from the outside in, yeah, I totally see where you're coming from. I get it. So here's the thing. MSPs typically, and this is true of any service vendor, not just an MSP, you're typically running with fairly tight margins. While we toss around this idea that labor has very high margin as opposed to product in all of the trades, which is not inaccurate. When you actually turn around and you look at selling a professional service, the margins on selling a professional service are actually pretty tight, because we get to a certain point where the breakover would just make more sense for the internal company to hire 2 additional staff members and buy those tools we talked about at the beginning of the video. So it's a delicate dance. And so the MSP is probably already priced at a point that is relatively competitive, even if it doesn't feel like it is. So there's that. But more importantly, there's an element of risk. and fundamentally how an MSP works and how any sort of contracted vendor works with you. When you contract a vendor to take over a service, you're making a risk shift statement. You are saying that there is a business risk, in this case, management of the IT, and it has a value, and we do not have the resources to mitigate this risk, so we're going to shift the risk over to someone else to mitigate for a price. And that's functionally how an MSP works. But the thing is, ultimately, yes, you're paying the MSP to accept some of that risk. But especially when you make changes, those changes aren't my changes, those are your changes. I don't care if you have new teams. I might care eventually because it might become unsupportable, but your business needs new teams, not my business. That's a business level requirement to be compliant, stay up to date, use the latest integration. Whatever the requirement is, it's a requirement of your business. That's not my risk as an MSP to just eat up without somehow saying, well, hang on a minute, this has a cost to it. Because that can be a very slippery slope for a vendor. Now, some MSPs will include this in their pricing because they predict a certain amount of risk. Other MSPs, as we talked about earlier, will, have it in whatever's in your contract's in your contract. But the point is, that's why they're assigning a value to this, because this is some risk that was not initially agreed to in whatever your original scope of services was. Therefore, there is a cost for them to absorb this new risk. That's pretty standard. And many of your other service vendors, if you outsource to them, especially on a recurring basis, likely do something pretty similar. If you have a cleaning service is giving you a price to clean the square footage. You add a little bit of new square footage, they're likely to come back and say, hey, we're happy to clean it, but the price is increased. You might be saying here it's not new square footage. All right, so you installed new banisters and the stairs internally, and they require a slightly different chemical to clean, and it's going to take a little bit longer. The cleaning service is probably going to come back to you and say it's going to charge a little bit more now because this new change to the environment, which they're happy to support, but was your environment that was changed, now has new risks to them that they need to change the pricing on. So that's why. So the very last piece I want to touch on quickly, because I think this is something that's common sense, but all of us forget this on both sides all the time, but yet we have to make a lot of decisions around it. An MSP is a vendor, and a vendor has to have more than one client. You're not their only client. And that means that everything they do is not always going to be done to the best possible ability. It could be done specifically for you. And I just think that Band-Aid needs to be pulled off. And this is going to be the case with any vendor anywhere. Even the best vendors everywhere, they're going to have more than one client. And as a result, there needs to be a certain amount of standardization. They cannot be completely custom and service every individual need of every individual client completely perfectly down to every little detail. And I can't think of a single industry that does. And I don't care how far up market you want to go. Even super, super, super ultra high-end vendors that only take one client at a time, like that guy who goes around and does those super expensive custom Porsches that he comes to you to build. Those are totally custom, right? Except they're not, because do you get to specify the exact mixture of resin and fiberglass in the kits that he uses? No, he's already standardized that process. Do you get to specify to him the exact method and bonding agents he uses to attach stuff? No, he's standardized that process. See what I mean? So it's the same thing at any level. And so your MSP both needs to have a standard way they approach this, which could mean that if you are a relatively more mature client, you might suffer a little bit because some of their other clients are less mature and their standard needs to, basically apply to everybody. That's possible. Or on the flip side, if you're a less mature client, you might be sitting there being like, why do they care so much about these things? I don't. It's likely because they have a standardized process that, once again, needs to be standard for everybody, not just you. But there's more to that statement that's worth unpacking. One of the things in some of the comments that came up on this particular post was basically some people were giving both the original poster a hard time, like why would you ask this? What's wrong with you? And then the flip side, the original poster sort of digging in a little bit and saying, well, I think it would be this, and I could do this, and yada yada. And one person said I could do it in less time, so on and so forth. You got to remember at the end of the day that you aren't their only client. If you were their only client, they probably could dial this in better, for sure. Like, I don't think that's an unreasonable statement to make about any form of outsourcing. If you were their only client, they could focus their entire delivery model around exactly what you need. You'd be the only one they have to think about, the only SLA they have to meet. And so they can keep you happy or fail miserably and it's 100% their fault. But you're not. So you have to fractionally parcel off some of their time to focus on your request to implement it in a way that they can support the next week and the next month and the next year from now. And that is going to sometimes mean that the response from an MSP is just going to feel a little clunkier than in your mind it should. And that's okay. Like, but that's a normal part of doing business. And you want an example, I'll give all of my sysadmin people a great example. How many times have you had an MSP tell you that they will only, like in the case of like a physical server, they're insisting on some sort of enterprise class product. It used, when we had platter drives, this used to be like 10 or 15K SAS drives. They're insisting on using SAS drives at 10 or 15K, and they want to have, you know, an enterprise grade RAID controller with onboard caching. And you're sitting there and you're like, dude, like Unraid and a couple of Western Digital Blacks is, I've had that running in my home lab for 7 years without a problem. What are you guys talking about? That disconnect sometimes of like, why is the MSP almost forcing us to use a solution that doesn't quite feel appropriate for our niche needs? That's where that comes from, is they need to have a standard way to deploy something that they know can be supported almost always. And so those enterprise class drives that come with the warranty, that are made to be on all the time, are less likely to have faults and errors that require tinkering and fixing. They need to run their business that way. They can't afford to say, I'm going to use Unraid with some consumer class drives, and if a drive fails, I'm sitting right here. I'll get the email alert, and I have 4 more drives in the closet, so I'll just hot swap one and we're fine. The MSP can't really do that. So I just think that's important to remember with why sometimes the way the MSP is going to approach your solution might feel a little bit clunky. So ultimately, without getting into contracts or technical feasibility, that's why. That's why Original Poster and all of my co-managed and sysadmin cousins across in sysadmin land, that's why your MSP wanted to charge you some amount of time to upgrade to new teams on your VDI. And by extension, that's why your MSP likely wanted to charge you to do some other sort of move ad change that otherwise seemed like it would be fairly trivial if you had done it yourself. I'm not saying you need to be happy with that or you need to accept it, but I hope a little context helps. Might help you have a better and more fruitful conversation with your MSP. MSPs, if you're listening to this, just remember that, like, kind of the same advice I gave this whole video, like, especially with your co-managed clients, they're not running IT as a profit center, and they are their only client. So you need to remember that when you propose solutions, and you need to remember to explain that. And it doesn't have to be a long-winded explanation, but I think it's worth pointing out that this is an unsolicited move ad change. We're happy to do it for you. Here's the terms by which move ad changes are governed. Here's why we do this. That could just be a couple of sentences. We need to spend a little extra time making sure that everyone in our team can support it properly. If there's a problem in the future and we want to do it right, and we need to do it in a standardized way. Not every client's going to get it, but I think some of your sysadmin and co-managed clients, they are going to get it, and I think they will appreciate that little bit of context. It's going to at least make them feel like you're not trying to take advantage of them, even if they don't just, agree with the reasoning. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. Co-managed is awesome. Sysadmins, you should hang out with us more. We're really not that bad.